morning. I hope that you are all keeping well and staying at home as much as possible. As we all stay home and stay safe, it might be that some of us are imagining that everyone else is coping much better with this current situation than perhaps we feel that we are. Some of us who live alone may be thinking, oh, those who are staying home with other family members, at least they have some company and someone to talk to. Whereas those of us who are living in crowded homes, maybe even stressful homes, may just be longing for some peace and quiet, some alone time. Someone I know who would call themselves an introvert is actually enjoying this time of being in seclusion. Well, I know that there are others who have not been able even to obey the rule to self-isolate and have headed out into the streets, putting others at potential risk. I must say, though, that most of the people I know have behaved very well, but it's interesting to see how we all respond in different ways. And Jesus' disciples were just like us. They responded to their situation in their own way. Following the crucifixion and then the message from the women telling them that Jesus was alive, we read today that they were afraid. So all except Thomas gathered together and they hid away in the upper room for fear of the Jews. But I wonder why Thomas wasn't there. Well, maybe he just needed some alone time. We don't know if he had been invited even to go along with the others. But if he was, he maybe just chose not to. In some of our streets over the past few weeks, neighbours have been holding special isolation events. I have seen drinks on your own driveway and music events. And individuals are inviting their neighbours to come out onto their driveways at a certain time for fellowship with other neighbours. Even in my own road, a musician neighbour who lives just a couple of doors away from me invited us to come out onto the driveway, bring a drink and some nibbles while he played music to us. Well, that was on Good Friday. It was a really good evening, most enjoyable. However, some of the neighbours didn't come out, even though I'm sure they'd all been invited. I wonder why they weren't there. I'm sure that each one of them had their own reasons. Maybe some of them just preferred to be alone, some alone time. Personally, I was glad that I had received the invitation. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to miss out and hear about how good the event was afterwards. That's not a nice feeling for anyone, to feel that you have missed out on something that was really good. I wonder if you have ever felt that way. Well, I expect Thomas felt like this after when the disciples told him that Jesus had appeared to them in the upper room when he hadn't been there. I'm not surprised that Thomas didn't want to believe that Jesus had appeared to the disciples. It was surely too good to be true. I'm sure that if he had thought for 1 minute that Jesus was going to appear, that he would have been there with the disciples. We might be surprised to hear that the disciples were so fearful. Peter and the other disciple had seen the empty tomb for themselves, and Mary Magdalene had seen the risen Christ, and she had told the disciples that Jesus was alive. So by this time on Easter evening, the disciples surely should have been out celebrating in the streets, not shutting themselves away in lockdown. But that was what they did. They isolated themselves away from others in a secret room because they were afraid of what the Jews might do to them. But not Thomas. Thomas was somewhere else. And while the disciples were there in that upper room, Jesus appeared, and he came through the locked door, came into the locked room and said, "Peace be with you." And the fear must have drained from their faces to be replaced by amazement and then by utter joy. Mary had been telling the truth after all. It was one thing to hear her tell that Jesus was alive, but it was another thing to actually see him in the flesh. And poor Thomas had missed it. So when the disciples later told Thomas that they had seen the Lord, Thomas said, "Well, unless I see the marks of the nail in his hand and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. I will not believe." That's why we call him Doubting Thomas. Doubting Thomas. But you know, I once heard someone call him Honest Thomas, because he was simply being honest. He hadn't seen Jesus, and it seemed like a story that was too good to be true. And it would have taken a lot of courage for Thomas to speak out against the other disciples. But that wasn't the end of the story, because Doubting Thomas, or Honest Thomas, actually went on to become Believing Thomas when Jesus came to visit again, because this time Thomas was there and saw him. And when Jesus came back for that second visit, he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas's doubts were swept away as he responded, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says to him, "Thomas, have you believed just because you have seen me? Well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now, the Bible doesn't actually tell us what happened to Thomas after that day, but it is widely believed that he took the gospel message to India and went on to grow the church there. What we do know, though, is that Doubting Thomas became Believing Thomas, and his belief changed his life. He who had probably been depressed and unbelieving became a faith-filled witness to the gospel message. And this was true for the other disciples too. Once they had encountered the risen Lord, they were transformed, and they weren't afraid any longer. Now the disciples were spirit-filled, ready to go on and face a hostile world with the good news of Jesus' resurrection. I really like this story of Doubting Thomas and the fearful disciples, because I'm sure that there are many of us at times who have doubts and fears. Perhaps when we have been asked to do something that we think that we haven't the ability or the resources to do, whether it be skills, finances, or even something else. We may be carrying burdens for the wrongs that we have committed, and we doubt that that feeling of guilt can never be lifted from our heavy shoulders. We may have even doubted that God is real, or even that we need Jesus in our life at all. We may be doubting or fearful now as we each respond in our own ways to this pandemic. We may be fearful for ourselves or for those we love. We may be going crazy, stuck at home, and asking, when is it all going to be over, and when will it be safe to venture outside again? Well, I'm afraid I can't give you the answers to all of those questions, but what I do know, and what I can say, is that we are not alone in this, even if you're living by yourself. God is real. God is with us in our belief or even in our unbelief. Even if we feel distant from him, he's still always with us, walking alongside us day by day, every minute, every single second. And I know that we will come through this stronger together. And I know that many of us are fearful at the moment. But I also know that our times of being fearful or doubting, there is Jesus always trying to coax us out of the miserable places that we find ourselves, those places of unbelief. And if we ever find ourselves or imagine ourselves sinking into that pit of despair, Jesus always tries to lift us out of the pit into his marvellous light. And I truly believe that every one of us need to hear that and cling to that truth today. When Thomas had trouble believing, Jesus came to him and gave him just what he needed so that he could believe. And Jesus can do that for us too. He can give us what we need so that we can believe, and he can help us out of the place of unbelief. He can relieve us of the burdens we carry and release us from all of our past sins that we choose to keep punishing ourselves with. He can give us new hope, even at a time like this. When we are honest, just like Thomas, God will come and he will transform us from within by his Holy Spirit. And when we have received that Spirit, we will find that we want to serve him in any way that we can. And we know that he will equip us with all that we need to do the work that he has commissioned us to do. He is preparing us, even now, as we are in our own homes. He's preparing us for the work that lies ahead. Jesus told his disciples in verse 21, "As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And then he breathed on them and told them to receive the Holy Spirit. It is that same Spirit that is given to us too, and the commission to share the good news is ours also. Our faith is not and was never meant to be a private affair. It's not something that we are ever meant to keep just to ourselves. So finally, if you are struggling, if you find yourself going through those really desert times and it feels more like Lent than Easter, or you find that you are in that place of unbelief, or even if you're just seeking God for the first time, start by being honest with yourself and with God. Keep on praying for God to help, even if he does feel distant or non-existent. Pray for him to come and help you in your unbelief, and speak to other Christians if you think that that might be helpful. I do pray that God will pour his blessing upon each and every one of us and reveal himself to us all in new and exciting ways. I pray that God will lift you if you are feeling that you are sinking in the pit of despair, and that we will all be encouraged to cling on to his marvellous light, enabling him to guide us through this time, so that when we come through it, we will all be re-energised and ready to go out and share the good news of the risen Christ and the love and peace of God with everyone in our communities and beyond. God bless you. Thanks be to God. Amen.